This is episode number 151. Today we're featuring William Scott Jennings, who's really a great painter, but really great also at explaining painting processes. I think you're going to enjoy this one.
This is the PleinAir Podcast with Eric Rhoads, publisher and founder of PleinAir Magazine. In the PleinAir Podcast, we cover the world of outdoor painting. Called PleinAir, the French coined the term, which means open air or outdoors. The French pronounce it plein air. Others say plain air. No matter how you say it, there is a huge movement of artists around the world who are going outdoors to paint. And this show is about that movement. Now, here's your host, author, publisher, and painter, Eric Rhoads.
Thank you, Jim Kipping, and welcome to the PleinAir Podcast. After all these months since we announced Denver as the location for the PleinAir Convention in the Colorado Rockies, it's been just like on fire. I mean, everybody's going. It's going to be a great time. We asked the convention people if they could fit more people in, and they said no. So I have a hunch we're going to sell out before we know it. So anyway, think about that if that's of interest to you. If not, that's cool too. Also, I wanted to mention, I keep people sending me notes and stuff. And so I just want to mention that I'd love to have you follow me on Instagram and on Facebook. Now, Facebook, I've got this dilemma. They limit you to 5,000 people, and I can't do that. And I didn't really want to turn it into a business account. I know I should, but I like to see what other people post, and I can't see that on a business account. So anyway, you can still follow me. I just can't follow you back, so I apologize for that. But check it out. It's Eric Rhoads on Instagram and Facebook. Coming up after the interview, I'm going to be answering some art marketing questions in the Marketing Minute. But let's get right to the interview. William Scott Jennings, welcome to the PleinAir Podcast.
Well, Eric, thanks for having me.
Now, this is a real honor. I have followed your work for a lot of years. I don't think you and I have ever met, have we?
Maybe not. It seems like at one time I saw you somewhere, but I may not have been getting to talk to you at one of the events. But it would have been a while back. Would have been a while back. Well, I'm a big fan of your work, so I guess you could call me a groupie. I hope that's okay. Sure, we all need groupies.
Well, you said to call you Scott, but your name is William Scott Jennings. Did you do that for marketing purposes, or where did that all come from?
Well, no, like I say, it was mainly because if I didn't use my middle name, if I just said William Jennings, that's what you have to put on almost every form. What's your first name? What's your last name? Nobody cares about the middle name. And this tended to be something that caused confusion among people. Oh, you're William Scott Jennings. So I said, yeah, and I just started using it that way a long time ago when I was pretty early into the marketing scene.
Well,
and so it stuck.
That's one thing I'm going to talk to you about because you've developed a really wonderful brand and reputation. We'll talk about that sometime throughout the podcast. Why don't we kind of start out with this whole painting experience for you? Where did it all begin? How did it begin?
I guess I really became an artist because I grew up traveling. My parents liked to go to national parks and that kind of thing. And so ever since I was very young, I was traveling. And I decided besides taking pictures, which didn't always work, I thought it was time to start trying to paint outdoors. And at that time, I was about, 16 or 17, and I'd never even heard the term plein air, and probably didn't hear it for years after that. But I quickly learned that painting from life was making my studio work better. And I was pretty much a studio artist and known as one well before I really got going with plein air.
Okay, but I moved
to Taos in 1981, and that was sort of the beginning of really going full bore into plein air.
All right, well, I'm going to back up here because you skipped a few steps.
Sure.
Here you are, you're in the national parks and you're 16 years old, and you talked about moving to plein air work because you were already doing studio work. Were you doing studio work as a 16-year-old?
That's when I started. It wasn't really professional until I was probably closer to 18. By 19, I was moved to Taos and was getting involved in the art scene out there. I knew all the artists that were well known at that time. Most of them lived sort of around the area of town that I lived in, so it came quick, and they were inviting me to go out and paint with them, and I decided I wasn't going to learn any quicker than doing that.
So were you kind of a wunderkind? Were you one of these people who had kind of natural talent, or was this something that you really worked hard at developing? Obviously worked hard anyway, but some people work harder than others.
My mom was a sort of a non-professional artist. She did a lot of horse portrait painting. She was really into horses when she was young and grew up training horses and stuff. And my dad was a doctor, and my mom wanted to raise horses. So we started doing that, and it sort of built from there. I've always been into the outdoors and into nature and that kind of thing, so I guess I always grew up with that in my head. But painting in plein air, like I said, even though my plein air paintings looked amateurish and terrible in my opinion, they quickly started firming up my experiences with painting in the studio. There's nothing worse than trying to work on a 30 by 40, and you have no real idea where the painting is going to go, how it's going to come out. Plein air paintings are the best way to be able to lock down an idea, color, composition, and that kind of thing. And you work out those problems on a 8 by 10 or a 10 by 12 or something like that. You save yourself a lot of time. And I started being able to pull the light out in my paintings much more adeptly once I was getting a real handle on painting outdoors.
So you talked about Taos, and you were studying with you were painting with other painters. Mm-hmm. Can you name some names?
A close neighbor of mine was Robert Daughters, whose style is about as far away as any of the Taos artists could have been from me at that point, because I was fairly traditional. Back then, I used to work with small brushes. I learned how I needed to speed up, get my time moving, get my application techniques down. And people like Robert, Walt I've known ever since I moved out there. Several others, but I won't go into listing too many. But at any rate, all the bombardment you get of information from different artists and how they work, even just seeing their paintings in the gallery, or two or three of us out at one place painting the same scene, and we have three absolutely different paintings, and all this stuff was a great learning experience. And I did that, and I've pretty much done that ever since. Even painting with students is a great way to see something new every once in a while.
I think this is a really important point of distinction for the people who might be kind of trying to figure this all out. The idea of painting with other people is important. Why?
Just for myself, it's mainly to see all the different ways that people experience the same subject. I'm not one that particularly liked painting in groups, and being following around, sort of what a lot of the plein air shows do. You're supposed to be painting in specific areas and being available for people to come and watch, which is all great. But it's when you get out there on your own and can really concentrate. It's a very mental process, and it wears my brain out, plein air paint for a day or two at a time.
Well, I think to the point that you talk about, I'm always blown away. I do this event in the Adirondacks every year, and we have 1 or 2 days where we all go to the same place to paint. Everybody kind of goes where they want to go, and there's some places we recommend, and sometimes we go in groups. But we lay all of our paintings out at night, and you'll see This past year, there were 86 people there, I think. And you'll see 86 different versions from exactly the same place, and you wonder, oh, I would have never thought of that. Or you see things that you can't even imagine, and it really informs your work.
It does. And you've got to stay open. You can't just say, well, what I do, this is the way it is, and this is the best way to do it, And when you get out there and you do just what you were talking about, each night, a group of the artists, we'd all go out to dinner, and then we'd all go look at the paintings that we had drying in the buildings somewhere. And it's just eye-opening. It's probably one of the things I like most about going to shows was just the extreme amount of information that you can get from how to develop a painting.
Do you remember any specific advice that you learned maybe from Walt or from this other gentleman that you mentioned?
Robert Daughters. Yeah, he's a guy that I'm not actually even sure if he's still around. He was about 10 years older than me, and I'm getting old. So, but at any rate, yeah, it's just that you see, the use of color. His color palette, their color palettes were totally different than mine. Their techniques involved the amount of application veracity they used was way beyond what I was doing at that time. But I certainly learned how to get a handle on it. And it carried that into my philosophy, which is a balance. My paintings have always been a balance between large studio works and small plein air works, and almost eliminated for a decade painting anything in between in size range. There's just no way you can even start a large studio painting, at least in my view, until you've done at least one, if not more, plein air paintings to sort of work out all the problems that you're going to come up with when you finally decide to break into the studio.
I don't have much experience painting large, especially really, really big paintings like you do. And I'm curious about, are you trying to replicate the spirit and energy of what you would do in a plein air study? Are you using it strictly for reference in terms of color and light, form? Are you adding additional detail into the big painting that you don't put in the small? Help me understand that.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'll say that my studio paintings either break down into being a finished painting or a color sketch or even just drawings. One of the things that I found out about these venues is that no matter how good you are or aren't, you learn, and you learn at a tremendous rate. I tell students that a studio painting is a culmination of everything you've learned up to till that point. You use all the tricks and knowledge that you have to build a painting. In most cases, you have to work with photographs or something that don't have the kind of color information and light information that you would get from a plein air painting. So, and when you, even just drawing for a half an hour at the scene, which I'll do a lot at the Grand Canyon or someplace that's very complicated and you maybe don't want to stop and paint right away, or the light's not particularly good for painting, it can still be perfect for doing pencil drawings. And just the amount of time that you spend, the half hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, that you spend painting and drawing from life, the information is much more ingrained in my head. I can recall, almost all the details for months of when I did a plein air painting of a spot, which helps me nail down my concepts, and it helps me to get started on the painting in the right direction. And it became to where, and that's why plein air painting became so helpful to me for my studio work. It sped up. It taught me application techniques that I didn't use before. When I first started painting when I was 17, actually I went to a commercial art school for 2 years in Nashville, Tennessee. And I was just blown away by the amount of conceptual stuff that I learned, but it was all strictly in a commercial orientation. By the time I finished the school, I'd never done an oil painting, and I'd never painted a landscape because those weren't what they were teaching. It was advertising art. And so I just started using the idea of going out and painting on location to fill in the gaps. The other thing that I did, I was living in California at the time, was go to every museum in California, study all the turn of the century work and even the earlier stuff. But I think the landscapes in the museums really peaked in the late 1800s.
I'm going to ask you just a completely ridiculous question, but there may be some meaning in it.
Okay.
All right, or maybe not.
Yeah.
When you, let's say today versus when you were 16, but today when you go and look at a painting, let's say you decide to go look at an Albert Bierstadt painting or something, what are you looking for? What are you trying to understand when you're looking at that painting?
Well, it sort of varies. When I first started, it was looking for one thing, anything. And as I got more used to painting large and this kind of thing, color concepts, depth perception, and exactly probably one of the biggest things I've had to teach PleinAir students is how to get going on a painting, how to see it. Because if you look at a painting and you're looking at the details, then you paint details. If you're looking at color or the light, then you start focusing on those elements, and it becomes. I have a system that I use in PleinAir, and slightly different in studios, but we'll talk PleinAir right now. And that's when I go out and paint. When I look at a scene, first of all, I want students in particular to tell me exactly why they pick any certain scene. If I'm standing in Arizona and got a group of 15 artists, there's so much to paint right there that it's mind-boggling. So I want to find out what they liked. What was it that made them pick that subject to paint? And whatever that subject was, that becomes the center of interest for a PleinAir painting. You've got to simplify. You've got to focus in on what the most important aspects are. And the way I do that is when I don't look at detail. I usually have students squinting, whatever they can do to diffuse the amount of detail they see, because too many of them gravitate to strictly trying to paint all the leaves on a tree. So what I do is when I look at something like that, I study the masses. And for me, the masses are any area of a given part of the landscape. Like if you're looking at a mountain, the shadow side becomes one mass, and the lit side becomes another mass.
So you're talking big shapes.
Yes. Well, and actually, whatever shapes there are. But on a PleinAir, I paint small for PleinAir. I don't try to paint 30 by 40 PleinAir.
What I mean is that when you say you're looking for big masses, you're looking for a big shape of
the obvious thing,
of shadow on one side and light on another, or something like that. Is that right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And what I then do to start the painting, I do a very simple pencil sketch. Pencil because I grew up in a commercial art world, rather than just using a brush. But at any rate, I only really get particular about painting the outer edges of a mass, because that's where viewers get all their information for size, distance, and that kind of thing. And everybody's drawn to the edges of masses because that's where the contrast is. Inside of those masses, ask myself, if there's only one color, and that's color and value, to represent that mass, what's it going to be? And that will be the first color I lay down, and I block it in. I use, basically outdoors, I use 1 3/4 inch wide bright to do the painting. And I have found that I can use the corners and the edges and stuff to do all the more exacting detail, but I can get broad strokes and get something laid in quickly without trying to do it with a 1/4-inch brush or something. So at any rate, I decide that, okay, this is the one color. So I will put that color down, then I will move to the next mass. It can be anything from the sky to the foreground and in between. And for each one, I want to do it with one basic color. And it comes out looking sort of like a posterized painting when you got it blocked in that way. Then, because I think that doing it that way, it allows you to lock in on your value and color to the point where it's just refinement after that point to get the rest of the information to come out of the painting. And after that first color is laid in, and I've done this all the way through the painting because I like to bring a painting together as a whole. I don't want to just start in one corner and work out a finished painting. First of all, I can't do that very well. And second of all, I feel that there's so much that has to be learned from one color reacting to the color next to it, brush strokes next to another brush stroke, the edges that they produce, everything else. But before I get into that, what I'll tell you about the masses that I do is after I've got everything blocked in, then I go back and I want to move, produce 2 more colors and values in that mass. And so I will go maybe a half a value lighter, and in the shadow, the lighter will become more of the reflected light into a shadow, and I will use as much color variation as I can rather than stretching the value range, because the narrower the value range, the more ability you have to use almost any color within those shadow masses to produce a strong element of, basically, that's all I'm painting is a representation of detail inside of those shadows. And so it's just putting down paint. It's not really trying to match everything exactly or draw. I don't like to draw or paint with brushes.
All right, I want to stop you there and just get some clarity. So you've done a big mass. Let's say it's a shadow mass. Okay. And then you're going to put, your goal is to have 3 values in that mass. The basic value that you masked it in at, and then a couple other values which are giving some depth to it, but you're keeping them within the shadow range, so it's very tight. They're tight values, a half a step. But you're trying to, within those values, you're looking, let's say it's a value 8. I don't know what a value 8 would be, but let's say it's a value 8, and that would be, you're doing some different shades of color within that same value 8, so that you're getting a sense of variation.
Yes, and one of the things that I have to teach artists is that if you go up a small value change, then you want a small color change. The colors are based on what I'm looking at. I'm looking into those shadows. If I see some orange, if I'm in Sedona, or reds or umbers, then I will use that color, and with a much smaller, you're allowed to do it with a much smaller value change if the color actually gives you enough of integrity to see, or either see it or think you see it, details.
Now, you talked about, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to make sure I'm getting some clarity here. We're talking about, in this particular case, adding some color into the shadow, the big block of shadow. Are you mixing, are these colors warms and cools? Are you trying to keep them all cool or all warm? What is it, depending on what you're seeing?
Yeah, it is strictly depending on what I'm seeing. Well, I'm a very literal artist when I'm painting outdoors, because I want to learn what it is that I see going on there. And if you start modifying the colors or the values, it just becomes problematic. You want, because each piece of the painting is affected by the other pieces of the painting around it. Like if you take a yellow and put a splotch of it on a white canvas, it looks one way. If you surround that yellow with green or blue or any other color or value you can think of, you'll get a different reaction from that yellow. It can seem brighter, it can seem duller, it can seem to be warmer or cooler. And so anyway, back on the values that I'm painting, I'm putting literally what I see in there. But what I don't want artists to do is start getting, if you get too wide a value range going on within a mass, then you lose all the information on the size, on the shape, on the distance. It just loses that element of solidity. And so by keeping the values very narrow and just using color primarily first, everything stays united. You can have greens and blues and reds and oranges all in those shadows. And if they're all in that very tight, no more than half a value off of where I had started, then they're all acceptable. You just have a lot more latitude in your color. When these values start get to the darker sides, in the shadows, say we're on the shadow side, and I already put in the some warmer tones, and the 3 is only a starting point. If I see 5 different colors in that shadow, then I'm going to get it in there. But I'm not going to paint it in a meticulous way. I'm just going to slapdash it into the painting to keep the painting from getting rigid and hard looking, keep the vibration, keep the movement going on in the brush strokes and that kind of thing. When I do the shadow side, it'll be a cooler. Shadows are generally the cooler colors. It could be a purple. It could be a umber. It could be blue. It could be orange and red. It just depends on what it is. But by keeping it tight, then your painting doesn't look like it's just coming apart. That's the first thing that happens when artists start doing that is they look at the painting and go, where do I go from here? And where I usually go is to simplification. I will take the brush and just start knocking down the over-intensified parts, whether it be a highlight or a shadow. I learned a long time ago, I don't even know where I got this information, but somewhere I read it, was that a lot of the turn of the century, well, not so much the turn of the century, maybe the original Impressionists, worked within basically a 3 to 7 value range for the majority of their painting. And as you work away from those middle 4 to 6s, I'll use less of that color and intensity. And as I get further and further out to the really bright sparkles or the dark little spots in there that tell you that your original color isn't the dark, it's just an illuminated shadow color within the dark. And I learned that I can only use like 1% of the 1s and 10s, like we were talking about earlier, and then a little more of the 2s and the 8s and 9s, but then 80% or more of the painting will remain in that 3 to 7 range, which allows everything to feel big. The first thing that kills size is having too much dark value in backgrounds.
Wait. Say that again. The first thing that kills size
is getting the values too hard and dark. You look at a mountain that's 5 miles away, and you see a couple slight variations. It'll be like if you start in the foreground, you may be working from a 1 to 10 range. Okay, as you move back through the painting, the values narrow until they get down to one blue mountain or purple mountain 10, 15 miles away. And
okay,
then
so that's atmospheric,
so narrow that there's only maybe
perspective, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But you said it kills...
If you try to put those hard darks in the distance, then you've got nowhere to pull it forward when you come into your foreground areas.
I get
your values
that.
are already
I get that, but you said it kills size, and I'm not sure what that meant.
Well, okay, because I feel that if you want the majesty of a mountain, the one thing that will kill it from being a majestic big mountain in the distance, and it'll just be a smaller mountain or hill or something in the foreground, is getting too much of a dark value going on before you're actually ready to have that. I saved the most intense lights and darks to work into the painting as I come forward, not necessarily just to show size coming forward, but to emphasize my purpose for even painting the painting. Whatever it was that I picked to paint that painting, that's where I'm going to have my biggest play of light and dark. My brush stroke sizes will drop a little bit or a lot to give a smaller representation of detail, even though I don't paint detail. I don't like to just paint every dot of a tree or something. I'll paint a mass of trees and I'll model that paint, and then only the outer edge where people are looking at it to get some information. That's where I'll show a few tree sizes. The rest of the trees on there are just a mass.
See, I think that sometimes people we get accused sometimes in our videos of saying there are secrets or there are tricks, and yet those are the kinds of things that really are secrets or tricks that a lot of people don't understand. Is painting a tree as a mass and then just putting a little tiny bit of leaf structure on the edge. It tells your mind there's leaves there.
That's right.
It's a great example.
Right. And then that modeling inside, which took you almost no time at all, is perfectly accepted by the viewer. Once they say, okay, I understand that's a mass of trees. I can see those trees out there on the edge, but there's no reason to have trees inside of that mass. That just makes the painting stiff and hard. So I try to make things as loose and comfortable as I can, and then judiciously use lighter and darker colors or harder edges or whatever it takes to create a representation. Again, like I say, I'm not a modern day painter that puts in every detail. I just like to grab the color, the shapes, the light, and the design of the painting.
Well, if you look at your paintings at your website, which is wsjennings.com, of course, I'm not seeing them in person, but they look detailed, and I think that's one of the tricks to all of this is that the eye is filling in the blanks. You don't have to have the detail there, but they look like they're detailed.
That's right. And that's important if you want to make a living as an artist. As an artist, I can't spend a month on a little painting working on all the extraneous parts. So I just march straight towards the parts that are going to catch your eye or are the parts that made me sit down and want to do that painting to begin with. And then as more often than not, as I work my way out of the center of interest area, the brush strokes get looser, less attention to detail. Maybe the values are a little bit closer together, just so that your eye and your brain automatically tell you this is less important over here where all this detail is. That's the important part. And that's where I want to focus. One thing I learned from Wilson Hurley was that, who was one of my favorite big painters, was that he would paint from the center of interest out. And once he got that center of interest where he wanted it, he just slapdash, big broad strokes, some canvas showing through. It didn't really matter to him, because once the element of the center of interest is working, then everything else just becomes an aesthetic choice by the artist. And as the more you pull all those edge pieces into the same amount of work that you had on your center of interest, the center of interest loses its intensity. So for that reason, I try to sort of push that effect. And as I move to the edges or the bottom of a painting where the foreground grasses are, I just use up my paint that's on my palette. I just start blocking it in heavier and let the paint mix on the palette. I actually let almost all my paint mix on the palette. I do very simple color mixing on the palette itself. Most of it has to do with putting one color on top of another, and what I call a three-step approach is that if I put a bright yellow on top of a shadow, okay, the first stroke puts it right on top and it just sits there. It's bright and it's sharp. If I hit that same patch of color that I put on there again, it starts settling in to the paint underneath. And a third time, by the time I get to the third time, if I go beyond that, it's sort of gotten lost. And I end up having to go back and
that's when you
redo
get
it
mud.
again. Exactly. One thing I do not to get mud is I do not use turpentine washes at all anywhere on my painting. The only thing I'll do with paint thinner is wash my brush out. But basically everything else is the paint as it comes out of the tube. If it's a tube of paint that's too thick, I will soften up that whole pile to where I want it to work, and then I will just go from there. But in general, when you use any kind of a painting mixture, whether it's turpentine or any of the synthetics, it just starts, it overmixes with your paint underneath, and maybe even after just one stroke, it's sort of lost in there.
Well, do you get concerned about cracking or issues, because the old theory about thick over thin, and so on. You said you soften some of your paints up. Do you soften them up with terps, or do you put linseed oil or something else in?
A lot of times it's just a little bit of oil, a little stand oil or something that I have mixed with turpentine. I'll touch a small amount, but it's not to make it really thinner. It's just because it was too stiff to use before I softened it up a little bit. Once I get it back to the consistency of every other color on the palette, then I feel like I can just work and not have to think about those kind of things.
So you said something earlier I want to go back to. You said that you had a different approach plein air painting than you do studio painting. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that.
Okay. Probably the biggest difference is that I go at the painting to begin with because they're big painting. I paint up to 6 by 10 feet, but most of them are in a 5 to 8, or 4 to 6 kind of size for the big ones. But I will block it all in as a value study. I mix cobalt or ultramarine, depending, but generally cobalt, and cad red deep and white. And I can make an entire range of purples and blues and warm ones and cool ones and all that kind of stuff with those two colors and white. And I will start with a big pile, and all shadow colors get blocked in solidly. I don't like to have any dots of canvas showing through or anything like that. I want to get good coverage. And that is not an egregious amount of paint. It's just good solid coverage. And that paint will stay wet for a day or so, enough to be able to mix the next colors in on top of it. And that's when I get back to that sort of a 3-rule thing. And this is how I handle those masses. I'll take the value slightly lighter. I'll put it on. I'll mix a color that I think is going to be close to it, but then it's that second and third touching of that color on the underneath color till it settles in and feels correct, and then I'll just stop and go to the next part. But these things, maybe I'm losing my place in all this, but these kind of things control a lot of the elements that I use to get to certain colors and feels in the painting without having to spend too much real time like mixing colors on a palette. I've known artists that they'll mix 40 colors up before they even start putting it on the painting, and they lay out a very systematic way of handling it, which I can't do. I'm one of these guys that flies by the seat of my pants when I paint.
Do you use a palette knife for any of your painting?
Go at it as fast as I can. I'm sorry?
Do you use a palette knife at all?
Yes, that's was going to be the next thing I said, was that basically I use a 1-inch brush to sort of block the paintings in as I would any other painting. But then I will change over to a palette knife, usually a 3-inch trowel, 3.5-inch trowel, whatever they are, and do all my detail and finishing work with the palette knives. This way I get a more textural quality on these big paintings, which is more important then than it is on the PleinAir pieces, because otherwise, you know, 6 by 10 foot painting, well, that's 60 square feet of paint. and so I want to get it in there as close as I can, as quick as I can. So instead of mixing a bunch of different colors, I will take the color that I think is going to work best, and I'll put it on. I'll hit it once or twice, maybe 3 times, till I get it to settle into the painting where it should be, and then I just quit touching it. You can't keep touching it, or it'll just disappear.
Well, I'm curious about that, and I would assume palette knife is the subject kind of dictates whether or not it's palette knife, because you have a lot of Grand Canyon-ish, desert-ish kind of scenes where there's a lot of hard rock edges and so on, but you also have these beautiful soft clouds. Are you using palette knife in the clouds?
Yeah. It's just a matter of how much extra, mixing I do once I get there. But yes, I generally hold that heavy paint look. But although I say heavy paint, but that's just heavy for me. I'm really not an egregious. I'm not Walt Gonski or one of these guys that uses up tubes of paint on a small painting. I go for more impasto effects in the highlights than most other places on the painting. But at the same time, it's just so much fun and so easy to just spread paint with a knife, and I do that in a slightly different way than most artists do. I will get a small bead of paint along the edge of the palette knife if I want to go in and lay in a secondary or tertiary color, and I will figure out the motion I want to use. I stand to paint, and I use my arm to paint. There's 3 ways to paint. You can use your fingers, your hands, or your arms. Well, your arms is best. And I will just lay that stroke on there with a light touch, and it will pick up on spots in the painting that already have a build-up somewhere on it, and it may skip other spots. And I allow about a 20% of the actual application to be just what happens. I like a lot of spontaneity in my paintings, and so I will lay that stroke on there. If it's totally wrong, I'll scrape it off and try again, or I'll just lay another stroke on top of it. But by letting the paint not over-emphasizing that you paint everything in at the same time, let things jump around, let things happen. About 3/4 of the things that just happen on a painting for me are generally things I go, ooh, I like that, and I'll stop. And if it's something I don't like, well, I'll scrape it and try again.
Bob Ross used to call those happy accidents.
Yep, that's what they are. And although Bob was a rather stringent guy as far as how he painted, I don't know that he used that. I mean, I'm sure he came up with plenty of happy accidents, but for me, that's sort of what makes the painting stay more alive.
That begs a really interesting question, Scott, and that is that when we all first start painting, our perception of what a good painting is a whole lot different than what it becomes many years later. And you look at certainly not to disparage something like Bob Ross, but you look at those paintings once you've gotten to a level of a certain development, and there's a big difference. I mean, it's like the fan brush used for the pine trees trick, that kind of thing. But how do you articulate how to get from kind of that level to a level that feels a lot more professional or high quality? And again, I'm not trying to denigrate that. I'm just trying to, there's definitely a difference. I don't know how to articulate that. Do you?
Well, I try. The first thing I would say is that I do not use different brushes for different things. I'll use one big brush, that 3/4 inch wide bright, usually a synthetic sable, to keep my basic work looking the same. It sticks out when you change from a flat bright to a fan brush to anything else. Picking up a camel hair brush, I don't have any need for them, and the only thing I have that's even close to a small round is what I use to sign paintings with. And in PleinAir, I don't even do that. I learned to scratch my signature in there with a nail about 20 years ago to keep from having to sign wet paintings with wet paint. So I did. But at any rate, keeping that consistency going and then just letting it evolve from there. I don't know if I can put a single word or a sentence as to how you get from that first point to the end. It's more for me, it was just becoming familiar with and feeling competent enough to handle things in a looser and looser manner once you understand it. A large painting, you look at John Singer Sargent. Okay, you go to a museum and say, "Oh my God," But what I've learned later was that I'd seen PleinAir studies. I've seen workup paintings, and then the third or fourth time is when he would actually after he's actually figured everything out with PleinAir and the studies, then he puts it down right the first time, which is an important part of that aspect, and being able to feel confident enough to let things happen.
I was just kind of breezing around at your website while you were talking, and one of the things I realized, the other major difference, well, there's two things I've noticed. First is that you're working into things constantly. Even though you've got big shapes and those big shapes are maintained, there's a sense of reality that comes through just the amount of little touches into the paint here and there that just make things feel like, you're not trying to paint every blade of grass, but it kind of tells your mind that they're blades of grass, and that's probably just from noodling things. But the other thing is color. And this is something I've talked a lot about on the podcast, and that is that and again, this is a preference thing. It's not a right or wrong, but I think a lot of artists tend to get to a point where they really mute their color quite a bit. They don't feel muted when you look at them, but you look at, if you were to compare a Bob Ross sky, which is just a pure grade with no gradation in it and no variation of color, versus one of your skies. Your skies have a lot of variation of color, a lot of really grays and muted color in them. Yeah, they do. Another thing I read a long time ago was how much Van Gogh was fascinated with Seurat's work. Okay, and I thought, well, that seemed unusual, but as I read more and studied this a bit, I realized what he's talking about. He does it himself all the time. He doesn't use little mechanicalized dots like Seurat did, but he will lay a chartreuse next to a yellow, next to an orange, and I decided that using that kind of a technique produces a more intense glow of color coming out of the painting. If I'm painting a gray sky, I will use at least 3 or 4 different muted colors to produce that gray sky, so that when you stand back from it, then it all falls together. And that's another thing I can talk about is a primary painting distance. But at any rate, a blue and a green and a yellow and a purple made to create a gray will have much more life in it than just that flat gray paint.
And so I do that through everything. A blue sky will have at least a couple different colors of blue and different values within those 2 different colors or 3 different colors, and just keep playing with it until I finally feel like it's resonating to me. I'm the only person I really try to appeal to when I'm painting. Everybody else, well, there's somebody for every painting out there, I guess. But I don't want to have to try to chase that. I just want to paint and when it feels right to me, then generally it's going to end up in a gallery somewhere.
So most of these big giant paintings that you're doing, are they coming from plein air studies, or are you from time to time either making them up in your head or changing them considerably, or even using photographic references?
I can do a little of all of that. But what I'll say is that I never really want to start a big painting without studies of that painting already. Because when I go out to the Grand Canyon and I paint 3 or 4 paintings a day, after about 4 or 5 days, sort of like when a bunch of us went down the Grand Canyon about, I don't know what it was, 10 or 12 years ago, is that you start seeing a repetition in the colors and the patterns when you lay out all your little paintings that you did. And so once you feel comfortable and knowing that you can lock into those, then I can start doing a little more variation. But in respective qualities there, and especially in the plein air painting, I just stay very literal. I try not to do anything consciously that is not in the painting, not in my view. But when I work in the studio, you need more information. And so the information of the basic colors and all that kind of stuff that I have in a finished, 10 by 12, 8 by 16 painting, whatever it happens to be, is great for that size, but to scale it up and not add any more information tends to not be a great big painting. So when I paint large, first of all, they've got to have everything right in them. So the studies are extremely important. And if I decide generally, one of the most obvious things that I'll do is sometimes I'll just say, I don't even want to look at that, and I'll add clouds. I'll bring mist in, or I'll do something. But I generally don't change the painting too much, except for making a foreground fit the painting, not just be exactly what I saw. There's no reason to paint anything exactly like what you saw if it's not going to be helpful, because nobody's going to compare the scene more than likely to your painting. And so, the biggest example is just, well, if that telephone pole's there, I guess I got to put it in, There's a lot of reasons to leave things out in painting. And the more you can leave out and then focus in on the parts that are important, the better the painting's going to come out.
So painting large has its challenges. I'm curious about that. I mean, you're painting 5-foot, 6-foot paintings in the studio. That's got to be a complete pain in the butt when it comes to, shipping them and prepping them for shipping. And how do you deal with all that? You just deal with it?
Well, it does a lot of times. Generally, I will deliver to the galleries. I've got a trailer, or I'll just rent a U-Haul if I can't fit it in something else, and deliver paintings that way. I try not to have to ship them. Once the galleries have them, they can deal with shipping them.
Do you frame them?
Yes. Yes, I do.
Well, even the frames, I mean, the expensive frames for that size.
They get monstrous, yeah. Yeah, they really do. I will tell you one thing right this minute, that over the last few years, it's gotten down to where the big paintings are mostly commissions. And so I will allow a client to give me basic information, what size they want, is it a Grand Canyon, is it a mountain scene? Give me a few hints and then let me go, and I will go. I don't want anybody walking up to me with a photograph in their pocket and says, can you do a painting of that?
How much control do you give the client in a commission situation? In other words,
very little.
If they say, I want you to paint my grandfather's ranch because I remember it. I mean, do you have to have a photographic reference in a case like that, or?
Well, I still probably wouldn't. If it's a big painting, I just wouldn't do it until I go out there and see it and do some studies and then decide. But one of the things that I will tell you is that I generally do not allow a whole lot of information. What I will do is a PleinAir-sized study. If I'm going to do a 4 by 6 foot painting, then I'll do at least 12/16 or whatever it happens to be, 12/18, I guess it would have to be. And I will have them okay the study. And if there's anything they don't like about the study or feel like, I wish I had this or that in there, then they can tell me about it then. And if it's not too egregious, which it usually isn't, most of the time they just see that and they like it. They're ready to go. So the next thing I'll do is my value study on a big painting, because I lock in all my values. I'll paint all the shadows in this purple gray that I was talking about earlier with cad red and cobalt blue and white. And I will mass in solidly all the shadow areas, and I will gradate as it comes forward. I'll strengthen the dark, I'll add, and when I get to the foreground, I'll add a little umber to it, because that umber tone, that temperature change, brings that color or that area forward much easier than just making the values stronger. And so when I do this and I get it all, and then I dry brush over all of the lit areas that are still unpainted. And with a dry brush, I'll just...
What do you mean you dry brush over? Say that again.
Okay. I've laid in all my solid shadows.
Yeah.
Everything else is a lit area. And I will use the same colors, the same pile of paint that I was using to lay in the shadows, but I will just use a big brush and lightly put the direction of the landscape in there and block it in that way, and a little bit at a time until I say, okay, then that's in the right value. Only my best highlights will be left as white canvas before I start the painting.
So you're doing that so that you can create a sense of texture or form in those lights.
Well, it's not so much that, it's just seeing the painting. When I get through with I try, except on really big paintings, to get them, 30-40, I'll get it all blocked in a day. And by the end of the day, I can see the whole painting. I can see a representation of all the areas, the lights, the darks, the mood of the painting can be represented in there, and just get it all done with one color, or basically one color. I will add, like I say, I'll add a little white as it goes back, or I'll add a little value as it comes forward, just to separate all the different elements of, like the Grand Canyon in particular, or a lot of mountain scenes. You'll just have element of element overlapping in shadows and in lights. And by doing this, I get that monochromatic study done, and then I'll show that to the client. And generally, you're pretty locked down by that point. They're just excited to see it, and they're getting excited. And after that, they don't see the painting until it's 90% done.
Yeah. And how do you get commissions?
Mostly through the galleries. I try to keep one, at least 36-48 or so, or larger in whatever my space is in any gallery. And so they can see it. They know I can paint big. And the other thing they see is they see the big paintings. They go, oh, wow, okay, that's palette knife and this. And if they're still happy with all that and they want me to do the painting, then I figure I'm going to have enough leeway to handle things the way I want. And I'm not going to take an egregious amount of direction from a client.
Do those big, I don't want to put you on the spot, you don't have to answer these questions, but do the big paintings tend to move well in the galleries, or are they there really more to stimulate commissions?
Yeah, well, I used to never even take commissions, but I started to, and it's only on the big paintings. They'd have to be 36-48 or larger before I'll accept a commission. Otherwise, they can just look around till they find a painting. But when he gets to the big ones, they don't sell as fast as small paintings, but they draw everybody that walks into the gallery back to your spot, because they can see from 30 feet away that big painting, and they're going to go there. And then they look at the price tag and they go, oh, what's he got that's smaller? Well, they're all around that big painting.
You have just described one of the great marketing principles of all time. It was developed originally by the jewelry industry. And if you walk in, I talk about this in my marketing classes, and you walk into a jeweler, they'll put a spotlight on a ring. And it's kind of like the first thing you see, and they kind of twist the tag so you can see the price, but you're not supposed to see it. And it's always at least 3 times what they want their average sale to be. So if they wanted their average sale to be $10,000, then it would be a $30,000 ring. And they know that very few people will come in and buy that $30,000 ring. Somebody will once in a while. And I've been training galleries to do this. Where they'll have a big painting that is exactly 3 times the amount of money as the painting they're trying to sell, and they will put the smaller paintings next to it, and inevitably somebody goes, gee, this is a $100,000 painting, I don't think I want to spend that. But they're not necessarily as concerned about spending $30,000 on a smaller painting. So that kind of approach works very well.
Well, it does. And one of the things that comes into play with my work that we haven't quite talked about yet was what I mentioned earlier is the viewing distance. Everything that I paint, I want to develop what is the best viewing distance for this painting. And of course, the bigger the painting, the farther away that is. To where a 6 by 10 foot painting, my viewing distance is going to be 30 feet away. It's going, when you walk into some room, the far wall, the high ceilinged room, big room, way across the way there is that big painting. And when they see that from there, that's when I want them, that's what I paint for. I do all of my mental worries and thinking about the painting, how am I going to handle this, from the viewing distance. And on a big painting, that would be way back on the other side of the room, or I use a mirror. In my last studio, I'm not in my big studio anymore right now, using a smaller situation. But when I could be 30 feet away from a 6 by 10, that might be far enough away, but at the same time, I'll have a 5 by 10 foot mirror behind the sofa on that back wall so that I can look at it and I'll get a 60 foot distance. And I make all my judgments on the painting from that distance, whatever distance it is that I think that painting is best viewed from. And when I do that, I eliminate all the other stuff that I would have been doing had I just been standing in front of the painting, working and working. It's a great time saver, and you can't paint the painting. You can't paint a painting that's best viewed from 30 feet away and stand 5 feet in front of it and make all your decisions about that painting. Yeah. So when I look over my shoulder, if I can't see what I'm doing, then I know I'm not punching it enough. If it seems out of place, then maybe it's too strong, or maybe there's other reasons. There's nothing better for me than making these evaluations in a mirror, because you instantly reverse the scene. So your brain doesn't tell you it's just your painting. It looks like you walked into a room and there's somebody else's painting. And it's very easy to be critical about somebody else's painting than your own. And so this is great. It points out every mistake, everything that I'm doing right or wrong. And I tell students all the time, it's all done with smoke and mirrors.
Literally. Yeah. At least the mirrors part. Scott, let me ask you as we kind of wrap this up, because I'm always curious about this. You've developed a really, what appears to be a really terrific career. It looks like you've made a great living as an artist. You've certainly got a very strong brand and very strong reputation. How much of that was intentional and how much was accidental?
I would say that I'm always trying to improve my work. I'm never really happy with much that I do. I can tell a story about how I kept a painting for 5 years, and then when I finally needed it in a gallery, the galleries didn't want it because it was a 5-year-old painting. My style was changing since then. So, but anyway, I do like to just have the conceptual idea that I got to improve. I got to make this better than the last one. I'll keep a painting that I really like around the studio for a few months, just so I can nail the next painting in line or something.
But what I'm curious about is how did you build your career? How much of your career building was accidental versus how much was intentional? In other words, were you doing a lot of intentional brand building, marketing of yourself to get to the point where you were commanding such high prices for your work? Or did it were you kind of sitting in Schwab's in the drugstore and somebody discovered you? I mean, what was the process like for you?
Well, I would say that I never did really go at it with a definitive idea as to what I was going to do. I was just always interested in my paintings getting better. I want my paintings to sell, and so the faster they sell, the more I can replace. And every time I put a newer painting in the gallery, I'm hoping it's some sort of a statement of what I can do now. Just like I said in the beginning, it's the studio work is just a culmination of what you already know in most cases, and you can try to expand from that. But if I didn't catch it in my studies, then I probably won't change it, because I feel that every time you start making changes, you start affecting the next thing in line, and it creates a domino effect of mistakes after a while. But at any rate, no, I'm just more interested in my own feelings about my work. Is that an improvement or is it not? When I went to palette knife for the big paintings, especially, I rarely ever paint with a palette knife below about a 30 by 40 because it just starts becoming a little cumbersome to get the effects that I was looking for. But for the big ones, I really needed that. So it's just a matter of a process of just making myself happy, to tell you the truth. And as long as my paintings are improving in my mind, then I just let the rest sort of come on its own.
Well, I will say this, and that is that having personal satisfaction and doing what you love is the very important premise, probably the most important foundational premise for selling and marketing your art, because you have to feel it, and it's hard to feel it when you're, as I oftentimes say, the gallery says, "Hey, paint me more of those little red barns," and you're like, "No, I don't want to. I will vomit if I have to paint one more of those little red barns." So I think. Yeah. And I didn't used to believe that, but I believe it now, and I think that that's a really key premise. Well, do you have, because we need to wrap up here time-wise, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, there's so much that I could talk about, but it's everything has to happen one step at a time for your progression. You can't climb a 10-foot ladder without starting on the bottom rung, and each step up is improvements or whatever it takes. And a lot of times you can't even recognize what needs to be your next step until you do feel enough of that exposure in your work.
Did you used to do bad paintings?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good. See, that's important for everybody to know and understand. Because,
Well, I tell you what, I've always painted big in my own, as far as whatever I considered big at the time. My first, when I moved to California and started PleinAir painting for the first time, that was before I moved to Taos. That was, it was like I had to learn everything. I had to learn not to use Grumtine. You remember that stuff?
Nope.
It was a Grumbacher kind of a turpentine or something that smelled like oranges. And this was back in the early 70s. And I got attacked by bees one day. I couldn't get them out of my paint and off my palette because they were attracted to this orange smell. Well, so you learn that, you learn not to do things a lot. You learn things to do, but you learn a lot of things not to do after.
Well, that explains something. I was wondering about this because I was over in in France recently, and I had a product shipped in from London, and it was an orange-based turpentine product, and I was getting a lot of flies, and I couldn't understand why all these flies were coming to me. They weren't coming to everybody else.
Well, I had to pack up and run out of the field one day, and that was when I decided I knew what was wrong.
Well, Scott, this has been an absolute pleasure. You really are a good teacher. I can just tell that studying under you would be fascinating because you really are able to articulate the process and what's going on. And it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the PleinAir Podcast today.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate the time to get to talk to you too.
Well, thanks again to William Scott Jennings. We call him Scott. I learned a lot from him. He's really good at what he does. He's an incredible painter, and he's got me inspired. I think I'm going to go out and get myself a 5-foot canvas. I asked him after the interview how he does that, and he's got this guy that stretches them for him and puts these crisscross bars in it to keep it stable. I think I'll get somebody to do one of those things for me, and I think I'll do a great big palette knife painting. It sounds like fun. Don't know what I'll do with it, but that'll be kind of fun. Anyway, how about some marketing ideas?
This is the Marketing Minute with Eric Rhoads, author of the #1 Amazon bestseller, Make More Money Selling Your Art, Proven Techniques to Turn Your Passion into Profit.
In the Marketing Minute, I don't always succeed, to answer your art marketing questions. And you can always email me your questions. I get a lot of these, but we try to get to all of them. Eric@PleinAirMagazine.com. This comes from Zach in San Diego. Love San Diego. Zach says, I like to use a combination of different types of paint, combining watercolor and acrylic, for example. Do you think this should affect my pricing in any way? Zach, I don't think anybody cares. Quite frankly, consumers typically don't think about that kind of stuff. Now, maybe if somebody's a really serious collector and, they're a big oil painting person or a big watercolor painting person, maybe, or a big acrylic person. But I don't think, galleries all the time sell paintings that are mixed media. Sometimes it's collage, sometimes it's stuff glued on. I just don't think it matters. I don't think that people think about that stuff. We tend as artists to overthink things. Most consumers buy paintings based on the painting. They don't think about the life, the longevity, the archival quality of the paper, the medium. They don't care about any of that stuff. What they care about is whether or not they like it. If it speaks to them, if they like it, then it becomes an issue of will they buy it. So the question then becomes, how do you put them over the edge? How do you help them buy it? Well, hopefully, there's somebody who's helping you, a gallery or somebody who's kind of selling for you or something like that. But I like to post the story of the painting. I like to put the story beside the painting when it's hanging in the gallery. They don't always do it. I don't always provide it, but sometimes. And stories are memorable. Stories sell. Facts don't sell. Stories sell. Facts, logic, nobody cares. Give people a good story that they can tell other people. And if they like the story, if it resonates with them, it's going to make them feel the need to own it, maybe personalizes it a little bit. They can relate to the story, and then when it's hanging in their house, they're going to tell their friends. The story, not the facts. Next question comes from Nathan in Aspen, Colorado. I'm guessing Nathan is probably a ski bum. Just guessing, because Nathan says, I'm graduating from art school in the spring. I already have an Instagram account with lots of followers, but I post about my art and other things. Should I start a new account for my art, or could my account, my personal account, just hurt my future sales in any way? Well, Nate, congratulations on your pending graduation. I love to catch people at this stage of their life, early stage of their career, where they're fresh and new and able to start from fresh, because you have the whole world in front of you and you can build a very successful and lasting career if you make the right steps early and keep that discipline. You can become world famous in a very short period of time if you follow the right steps. So you're getting a good start. You're asking the right questions. I usually don't say this, but I highly recommend that you read my book. It's about art marketing. They'll tell you about it later. But I think the book really outlines some really important basic principles that you should get. And there are also, a lot of those principles are in my videos. But I think find a way to at least get the book. It'll cost you $25 or $29 or something like that. Become a student of marketing and you will thrive. The greatest artists in the world, the ones who were known, the Rembrandts, they were great marketers. Rembrandt was a brilliant marketer. Picasso was the best marketer on earth. Whether or not you like his work, he sold a lot of it and became very, very, very successful, wealthy. So whether or not that's why you're doing it, you don't have to do it to become wealthy. Now, to your questions, is there a right or wrong answer? I think that I'm kind of conflicted about this, Nate. People like to get to know the person. They want to know a little bit about your art if they're really interested in you as an artist. But, in Instagram, I don't know about you, but I follow people based on what they are producing, especially artists. So it's like, if there's an artist I love, I really want to see his or her work. I don't really care about what they're doing with their life. Now, if I know them, I care. And maybe that's part of helping people get to know you. But the thing you want to avoid are things that are polarizing, unless that's the image you're trying to project, but that can be dangerous. I have a friend who's an art gallery owner, and she actually fired an artist because of something he put on Instagram or Facebook, because she heard from a collector of that artist's work who wanted to return the work because she was repulsed by something they put on social media. Well, she had to take the painting back. I mean, what else could she do? She refunded the money, and then she fired the artist. And she said, "I can't have this kind of behavior from you. You're a professional. You're supposed to be a professional. You're supposed to act like a professional." So keep that in mind. You can hurt yourself. If I always say, if you're showing pictures of yourself with your head in the toilet after a strong night of partying, that's probably not something some collectors are going to want to see. Again, maybe it reinforces your image if that's your image. But I think that, I'd rather not risk it. I kind of like to walk a line. You'll never hear me talk about politics or religion or, things that are going to turn a lot of people off. I mean, I might say it personally to somebody, but usually not even then. I just try to stay away from those kind of polarizing things. And some people don't care about that. Others do. I have friends who just cannot contain their political opinions, and they turn some people off, and those people will never buy their artwork. And they don't understand why that, it crosses that barrier, but it just irritates some people. So just be careful about that. By the way, Nathan, don't ever let discouragement get in your way. The people you hang out with are going to have lots of opinions. If you're hanging out with a lot of other artists, some are going to complain all the time about how bad things are, how they're not selling work. Others are going to tell you how things are not going the way they want them to. Be careful about surrounding yourself with negativity. You want to listen to people, you want to respect them, but surround yourself with people who are positive. It's a great example. I just heard from somebody who was telling me how awful things were in a particular town. And then I was with a dealer from that particular town who told me he just had the best year in his business. So, what makes the difference there? I don't know. But, when things are up somewhere, they're down somewhere else. But you can always find out where they're up, and you can always go into that area, into that market, into wherever things are going well. So just keep that in mind. Also, you didn't ask, but since you're soon to be fresh out of school, a couple other pieces of advice. There's a lot of recent evidence that the promise of social media as an ad medium isn't always effective. It is effective, don't get me wrong. Procter & Gamble just removed $150 million from Facebook and Instagram because they found out it was not increasing their sales, and they put the money started putting the money back into traditional media, and they're already seeing increases in sales. We have a tendency to believe because something is new and shiny and hot that it's going to succeed. You know, you want to go where the money is. I always say stand in the river where the money is flowing. And so be thinking about other things. For instance, there are the people who you hang out with might all be social media junkies. I know I am. But you also have to understand that not everybody who buys is a social media junkie or is going to follow you, and that might not be effective. Also remember this, all decisions are emotional. When it comes to selling anything, all decisions are emotional. That may not apply to toilet paper, but even then, you know, it probably does, because it's like somebody wants the stuff with aloe in it because they think it makes it a better experience. Experiences are emotional. But all emotions all decisions are emotional, but they're justified with logic. So you can sell by facts and logic, but you'll lose almost every time when you sell by facts and logic. We don't buy a car because it's practical. We buy a car because it speaks to us. It speaks to our emotions. It speaks to who we are. You know, the color, the style. We buy things based on who we are. We try to get something that matches us. We might rationalize it or justify it with gas mileage or some other such thing. So keep this in mind. Social media has people focusing on fact-based selling and data, and that's okay, and it works in some instances, but always think about why people buy and how you can appeal to them. I mean, you know, for instance, you know, a full-page ad in a magazine that's going to all the prominent art buyers, they can really see that ad. You know, there's a lot of difference in that space between, you know, what they're seeing on a phone. And, you know, if they're all gathered in one place, this is a better place to, not necessarily better, but it's a place to sell them. And you might want to think about that kind of thing. But sell with emotion. Learn how to sell with emotion. Practical and logical stuff typically don't work. And even with people who are in positions that are practical, like lawyers or accountants or doctors or otherwise, most of those decisions are still practical. So I hope this helps. That's the Marketing Minute.
This has been the Marketing Minute with Eric Rhoads. You can learn more at artmarketing.com.
If you've not seen my blog where I talk about art and life and philosophy and lots of other stuff, sometimes some pretty crazy stuff. Anyway, I think we're up to 250,000 people now who are reading that blog. Amazing to me. I mean, it's just hard to fathom. Anyway, check it out. You can share it with your friends when you get it. It's called Sunday Coffee. To get your first copy, and you can subscribe for free, it's at coffeewitheric.com. Love doing the podcast. Love talking to artists. Love helping you get information that's helpful to you. I'll see you again sometime, like next week. My name is Eric Rhoads. I'm the founder and publisher of PleinAir Magazine. And remember, it's a big world out there, and we, together, need to go paint it. I'll see you. Bye.
This has been the PleinAir Podcast with PleinAir Magazine's Eric Rhoads. You can help spread the word about plein air painting by sharing this podcast with your friends. And you can leave a review or subscribe on iTunes so it comes to you every week. And you can even reach Eric by email, eric@pleinairmagazine.com. Be sure to pick up our free ebook, 240 plein air painting tips by some of America's top painters. It's free at pleinairtips.com. Tune in next week for more great interviews. Thanks for listening.